I am 81 years old, and if you ask me how I spend my mornings these days, I would tell you that I wake up earlier than most people expect from someone my age, not because I am filled with energy or eager anticipation of the day ahead, but because the body, once it reaches a certain stage, refuses to cooperate with the luxury of long sleep. The house is quiet, the kind of quiet that used to be comforting when my wife was alive, because then I knew she was just in the kitchen humming as she prepared breakfast, or perhaps sitting in the living room reading one of her mystery novels, but now the silence feels heavy, like a reminder that the walls remember more than I do. I make my way to the kitchen slowly, not because I am feeble, though age has put its weight on my knees, but because I have grown accustomed to savoring every step, every ritual. I grind coffee beans myself, though I could easily buy pre-ground coffee. I insist on this small effort because it connects me to Margaret, my late wife, who had always said that a man should never give up the little habits that made him feel human. She's been gone for 12 years, yet I still hear her voice in these mundane details, and sometimes I even answer aloud, like a man carrying on a conversation with ghosts. After the coffee is poured and the house begins to smell less like emptiness and more like memory, I settle at the table and spread out the newspaper, though my eyes grow tired faster than they once did, and I rely on magnifying glasses to read the print. I still like to pretend that I am part of the world, that I follow the news, that I care about markets and politics. But the truth is, what keeps me tethered to this ritual is habit more than interest. I was once a professor of law at the University of Virginia, respected, even feared, by students for my endless lectures on constitutional interpretation and the philosophy of justice. It seems ironic, even cruel, that a man who spent his life teaching others about the sanctity of law and the limits of greed now finds himself betrayed by his own blood, dragged into court battles not against strangers, but against the very son he once dreamed would inherit not only his fortune, but his values. I do not tell this story lightly. I tell it because silence at my age feels like complicity, and I cannot die complicit. My son Derek is 50, though he likes to tell people he is younger. He works as an investment consultant in Washington, which to most sounds glamorous and dignified, though to me it sounds like a polite way of saying he helps the already wealthy find ways to grow even richer while shielding themselves from responsibility. He wears the tailored suits, drives the imported cars, attends the charity dinners where photographs are taken for society pages, and yet, when he comes to visit me, which is not often, he looks around my house as though it were a motel he cannot wait to check out of. I remember him as a boy with dark hair that always fell into his eyes, asking me endless questions about court cases, tugging on my sleeve to know why a judge said this or why a lawyer argued that. And back then I allowed myself the fantasy that he might become a jurist, a man who would respect truth, but somewhere along the way that curiosity hardened into something else. He learned more about numbers than about justice, more about loopholes than about principle, and though I tried not to see it, Margaret did, and she would sometimes whisper to me in the night, "We gave him too much, Henry, too much, too soon." The estate we built was not extravagant, at least not in the sense that it was built on vanity. I published books, I lectured, I sat on panels, I consulted for firms that sought my interpretation of constitutional disputes, and over 4 decades I accumulated more than enough for a modest but secure life. Margaret's family had also left her a considerable inheritance which, invested carefully, grew into a trust that by the time of my retirement amounted to $12.3 million, a sum that still surprises even me when I look at it. Written in black ink on banking documents. When Margaret died, I felt both the weight and the freedom of that fortune pressing on me. It was meant not only for Derek, but for causes that mattered to both of us. Scholarships for students from poor families, research into medical ethics, donations to the public library that had once been our refuge as young parents with little money, but plenty of hope. I wanted our wealth to have a legacy beyond a single bloodline because I had seen too many families torn apart by the very thing they thought would bind them together. Yet Derek never accepted that vision. Whenever he visited, our conversations quickly circled back to efficiency, tax optimization, keeping things in the family. He would say these phrases as if they were holy, as if the greatest sin a man could commit was generosity toward the strangers. I used to smile and deflect, but inside I grew uneasy. It was not only greed that disturbed me, but the certainty with which he dismissed anything outside his own advantage. I began to feel as though I had raised a stranger, someone who wore my name but not my values. Still, I am an old man who does not wish to quarrel endlessly, and so I let his words hang in the air, answered with a shrug, and hoped foolishly that when the time came, he would understand the decisions I had already made in my will. It is strange, perhaps, to describe the daily life of a man who sits alone in a large house surrounded by books and photographs, but this is the context in which betrayal arrives, not in moments of grandeur, but in the slow erosion of trust, in the silence after a phone call ends too quickly, in the letters from lawyers that appear without warning. My days are filled with simple activities, tending to the roses Margaret planted, writing notes that I never send, listening to records of Glenn Miller because the brass reminds me of dancing in our youth. To outsiders it might appear peaceful, even enviable, but beneath the surface lies a tension I cannot ignore. I know my son watches me, not with love, but with calculation. He counts the pills in my medicine box. He comments on how often I repeat myself. He suggests that perhaps it is time to consider moving to a retirement facility for my own good. These are not the gestures of care, they are rehearsals, lines spoken, in preparation for an argument in court. Sometimes, when the evenings grow long and the shadows stretch across the floor, I wonder if I am partly to blame. Did I fail as a father by providing too much security, by sparing him the struggles that shaped me? I came from nothing. My parents were teachers who scraped through the Depression. I carried books through rain, worked nights at a mill, and studied by candlelight. That hunger for knowledge, that discipline, was my inheritance. Derek never knew such hunger. His path was paved, his tuition paid, his car insured, his mistakes forgiven, with checks I signed in weary silence. Perhaps he mistook generosity for weakness, and now he believes the law, my law, the very system I devoted my life to, can be bent by his ambition. If you ask how I feel about my life as it stands, I would say I am not lonely, for solitude is not the same as loneliness, but I am wary. I carry my days with the awareness that trust, even one worth millions, can be twisted into a weapon. I did not expect to spend my twilight years preparing for battle with my only child, but such is the irony of life. You spend decades defending principles in courtrooms filled with strangers, only to find the fiercest trial waiting for you at your own dinner table. And so I tell this story not as a chronicle of money, but as a confession of what it costs a man to see his son stand before him and say, without hesitation, the trust is mine now. As if love, memory, sacrifice, all could be reduced to a number, written on a balance sheet. The moment that shattered the fragile peace of my routine did not come with thunder or some dramatic announcement, but with the soft creak of my front gate and the sound of my son's voice carrying through the hallway in a tone that was too casual to be natural, the sort of rehearsed ease a lawyer adopts when approaching a witness he intends to corner. I had just returned from a brief stay in the hospital, nothing catastrophic, merely a fainting spell at the grocery store that the doctors explained as dehydration and fatigue. Yet the incident was enough to spark concern among the neighbors, and before I knew it, Derek was calling the hospital daily, asking questions not about my recovery, but about my mental clarity, as if a man who could recite entire passages of Blackstone's commentaries from memory might somehow have forgotten who he was overnight. When I opened the door, Derek stood there with the smile of someone who had already decided the outcome of a conversation, and behind him was a tall man in a gray suit holding a leather briefcase, his expression professionally neutral in the way only lawyers manage, as though he had been instructed to regard me not as a father, not even as a client, but as a problem to be solved. "Dad," Derek said, stepping inside before I could answer, "I thought it was time we looked at some paperwork." Just a few updates to keep things in order. You know how important it is to stay organized, especially after your little episode. I wanted to tell him that it had been no episode, merely a temporary weakness corrected with fluids and rest. But the words lodged in my throat as I realized he was already signaling the man behind him to set his briefcase on the dining room table. The table where Margaret and I had once celebrated birthdays with cake and laughter. The intrusion felt obscene, yet I allowed it, partly because I was too weary to start an argument and partly because I wanted to see just how far he was willing to go. The lawyer introduced himself as Mr. Carlyle, a specialist in estate management, and began laying out sheets of paper with neat, clipped motions, each page covered in the sort of legalese I had spent a lifetime teaching students to decode. As he spoke, I noticed Derek watching me closely, not the way a son observes his father out of affection, but the way a predator studies prey for signs of weakness. Carlyle explained that these were merely updates to my trust, clarifications to ensure efficiency, nothing that changed the overall intent. But when I took up the first page and adjusted my glasses, the words leapt out at me with the cruelty of a verdict already written. Upon the death of the grantor, all assets of the trust shall pass in entirety to the beneficiary, namely Derek Hollis. The charitable allocations, the scholarships, the donations Margaret and I had discussed for years, all erased as though they had never existed. I looked up at Derek and asked quietly but firmly what had happened to the original distribution. He did not flinch. He merely said, "Dad, times have changed. Taxes are a nightmare. Bureaucracy eats money, and honestly, who better to handle it than family? It's what Mom would have wanted. Keep it simple. Keep it in the bloodline." The invocation of his mother's memory stung more than the betrayal itself. Margaret had been the one to insist that part of our fortune should go to those who had no family to rely on, to young people who reminded her of the struggling students she had tutored when we were first married. For Derek to twist her name into justification for his greed was a cruelty I could hardly bear. I set the papers down and told Carlyle that I would not be signing anything that afternoon, that I required time to review every clause. Carlyle gave a small nod, unfazed, and began packing his documents, clearly accustomed to resistance and confident it would dissolve with pressure. Derek, however, pressed his palms on the table and leaned toward me, his voice dropping. "Dad, you don't want to make this complicated. You've had a scare with your health. The last thing you need is messy paperwork. Let's do this now and avoid trouble later." It was in that moment I realized he had rehearsed this scene in his head, perhaps even believed that a weakened old man would sign away his intentions without protest. I nodded slowly, as if conceding, and told him we could revisit the matter after I had some rest. My compliance seemed to satisfy him. Carlyle snapped his briefcase shut. Derek patted me on the shoulder with the theatrical affection of a politician shaking hands at a rally, and within minutes they were gone, leaving the house once again in silence. I stood there staring at the empty table, my chest tight not from illness, but from rage. I knew what I had to do. That night I drove myself, though my doctor would have advised against it, to the small branch of the bank where I kept a private safety deposit box. It was nearly closing time, but the clerks knew me well, and one of them, a young woman with freckles who had always reminded me of my students, greeted me with concern. I told her I needed to access my box, and with the steady hands of a man who has taught himself to master fear, I retrieved my original will and the documents outlining the trust. Back at home, I sat at my desk, the same oak desk where I had written lectures for decades, and I began drafting what would become my second will. I wrote slowly, carefully, every word chosen with the precision of a man who knew that clarity could mean the difference between justice and manipulation. I reaffirmed my commitment to the causes Margaret and I had cherished. I detailed the amounts that would go to scholarships, to the library, to medical research. I described the fund for the preservation of historical documents, something that had always mattered to me as a scholar, and then I wrote, with deliberate emphasis, that my son Derek was to receive only a fraction of the estate, enough to provide him comfort, but not power, not control, not the ability to undo what his mother and I had envisioned. At the end, I added a personal note addressed not to him, but to any judge who might one day read the document, explaining that this decision was made not out of malice, but out of necessity, because I had seen in my son's eyes the hunger that consumes all reason. The following morning I returned to the bank and placed the new will in the deposit box, sealing it as though I were burying a weapon for future use. The manager witnessed my signature and added her own as verification, ensuring its validity. I left the building with a calmness that surprised me, a calmness born not of peace, but of resolve. Derek thought he had cornered me with his lawyer and his paperwork, but he had underestimated the stubbornness of an old man who had spent a lifetime dissecting every trick of legal language. From that day forward, every visit from Derek carried with it a new tension. He would ask casually if I had thought about the revisions, remind me how complicated the world was, mention friends of his who had struggled with probate battles. I would nod, smile faintly, and assure him that I was considering everything carefully. What he did not know, what he could never have imagined, was that the real decision had already been made, written in ink and locked away, waiting for the day when truth would have to confront deception in a court of law. And though I could not yet see the shape of that confrontation, I sensed it looming, like thunder, behind the horizon. It was only a few months after the incident with Derek and his lawyer that the first true fracture appeared, a crack, not just in the paper-thin fabric of civility between father and son, but in the very ground on which my old life rested, and it began, as so many humiliations of age do, with a sudden accident that reminded me I no longer commanded my body with the certainty I once had. I had been driving back from the library, where I occasionally volunteered to advise students on research projects, a quiet afternoon with a light drizzle on the windshield, when another driver, impatient at an intersection, ignored a stop sign and sent his car skidding directly into the side of mine. The crash was not fatal, not even catastrophic, but it was violent enough to shatter the passenger window, twist metal, and leave me with broken ribs and a deep gash on my arm. I remember the sirens, the hands lifting me onto a stretcher, the blur of a hospital lights above, and then the painkillers swallowing time into a haze. When I regained proper consciousness the next day, Derek was standing at the foot of my bed, not with tears or even concern, but with a tight expression of focus, as though he had been handed a case and was rehearsing arguments in his head. The doctors assured me that my injuries, though painful, were not life-threatening, and that with rest and therapy I would recover. But Derek seized upon the incident as evidence of decline, repeating to every nurse who passed that his father had been confused after the crash, that perhaps he had blacked out at the wheel, though in truth the police report already established the other driver's negligence. I could sense him planting seeds, not in my medical chart, but in the air, for the benefit of witnesses who might one day be called. He leaned over me and said in a low voice that I should not worry about anything, that he was already taking steps to make sure my affairs were in order, words that chilled me more than the IV fluid coursing into my veins. I asked him what he meant, but he only smiled faintly as if addressing a child and told me to focus on healing. 3 days later, while I was still confined to the hospital bed, I learned from a sympathetic nurse that Derek had filed a petition with the court requesting temporary guardianship over my finances and medical decisions, arguing that I was no longer fully capable of managing them myself. The words hit me like another collision, this one not of metal, but of trust. Guardianship. The legal tool I had taught countless students to examine, a mechanism designed to protect the vulnerable, now being twisted against me by my own son. It was clear what he sought, to gain legal authority over my accounts, over the trust, over every decision that would have once been mine alone. I felt anger burning through the sedatives, and for the first time in my life, lying in a hospital bed, I understood how quickly a man could be stripped not only of dignity, but of identity, reduced to a ward of the very child he had raised. I asked for my phone and called an old colleague, Judge Harold Whitmore, retired now, but still sharp and respected, a man who had once co-taught seminars with me on constitutional protections. When he heard the tremor in my voice, he came to the hospital that very evening, pulling up a chair by my bed with the calm authority of someone who had seen too many injustices to be easily rattled. I explained everything, the staged visit with Derek's lawyer, the forged narrative of decline, the petition for guardianship. Harold listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and then said with deliberate clarity, "Henry, you must understand. This is not about your health. This is about control. Derek is positioning himself to take everything before you are even gone. We will not let that happen. But you must act quickly, and you must be strong." It was Harold who arranged for an independent psychiatric evaluation, bringing in a respected specialist whose reputation could not be easily dismissed. The doctor sat with me for hours, asking not only about my health, but about the intricacies of my career, the cases I had argued, the books I had written, the judgments I had critiqued. I answered every question with the precision of memory honed by decades of scholarship, and when the evaluation was complete, the doctor smiled and told me that I was in full command of my faculties, sharper than many men 20 years my junior. That report would later become a weapon in my defense, but in that moment it gave me something even more vital. Reassurance that I was not mad, that the betrayal I sensed was real, not paranoia. When Derek visited the next day, he was surprised to find Harold sitting beside me, a stack of papers already in hand. My son tried to mask his irritation, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. "Dad," he said, "we need to make decisions rationally, and this is not about me. It's about your safety. You could have died in that crash. What if it happens again?" "Don't you want someone you trust to take care of things?" Harold cut him off smoothly, saying, "The only thing Henry needs right now is rest. The court will hear both sides before making any decision." Derek bristled at the implication that his petition might fail, but he forced a smile and muttered something about only wanting the best for me. After he left, Harold leaned close and whispered, "He is rattled. That's good, but he will come back harder." The following weeks were a blur of physical therapy and legal maneuvers. While I learned to breathe without wincing from fractured ribs, Harold prepared affidavits, lined up character witnesses, and gathered the evidence of my lucidity. Meanwhile, Derek began visiting less frequently, perhaps calculating that his presence no longer inspired sympathy, but suspicion. Yet I could feel his hand in small details, a call from my bank asking whether I truly intended to authorize certain transfers, a letter from an insurance company referencing changes I had never requested. Each sign reminded me that he was already testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses. At night, lying in the dim hospital room with the rhythmic hiss of machines around me, I thought about Margaret and how she would have wept to see her only child circling his father like a vulture. I thought about the young Derek clutching my hand on the first day of school, asking if I would still be there when the bell rang. The memory stabbed me, for I realized that somewhere along the years of privilege and ambition, that child had been buried, replaced by a man who could look at his father's injuries, not with compassion, but with opportunity. And I knew then, with a certainty that hardened in my chest, that the real battle had only begun, that I would not survive it by sentiment alone. I would need every ounce of the lawyer I once was, every principle I had taught, every strategy I had seen played out in courtrooms, because my opponent was no longer a faceless adversary, but the son I had once believed was my legacy. The courtroom smelled of varnished wood and stale paper, a place I had once dominated as a lecturer, a witness, even an advisor. But now I sat at the defendant's table, not accused of crime, but of frailty, which in some ways is a far crueler accusation because it strips a man not of his freedom, but of his dignity. Derek had filed his petition for permanent guardianship, insisting that the accident and my age rendered me incapable of rational management, and though I had Harold by my side, I felt a deep humiliation at the mere existence of the proceedings. To prove one's sanity is perhaps the most degrading task imaginable for someone who has spent a lifetime proving truths that mattered beyond the self. And yet here I was, reduced to testimony about my own mind, as if memory, reason, and will were mere commodities that could be weighed on scales. Derek entered with his lawyer, a polished young man with an expensive tie and a smirk that betrayed confidence in victory. My son avoided my eyes at first, but when he finally looked at me across the aisle, there was no hesitation, only the cold calculation of someone who had already envisioned the estate as his. The hearing began with Derek's side presenting doctor's notes taken from the hospital immediately after the accident, highlighting moments when I had been disoriented under sedation, fragments of conversation where I asked after Margaret, though she had been gone for years, details that any fair observer would recognize as the natural confusion of a man recovering from trauma and drugs, but which were here twisted into evidence of decline. They spoke of risk, of instability, of the danger of leaving millions under the control of someone who might forget to pay a bill or misplace a signature. Their arguments were precise, almost mechanical, yet each word was a dagger aimed at dismantling the image of the man I knew myself to be. When it was our turn, Harold rose with the slow authority of a man who did not need theatrics, only facts. He submitted the independent psychiatric evaluation, 300 pages affirming my lucidity, complete with cognitive tests I had passed with near-perfect scores. He called upon colleagues from the university who testified to my continued lectures and writings, students who described my guidance as sharp and uncompromising. And then, with a pause that seemed to stretch across the chamber, he asked the judge's permission for me to speak on my own behalf. I rose carefully, my ribs still sore, but my voice steady, and I spoke not as a defendant but as a teacher, explaining that forgetfulness under morphine does not constitute incompetence, that momentary disorientation after a collision does not erase a lifetime of clarity. I reminded the court that the law is not meant to serve as a shortcut for greed, that guardianship was designed to protect those who truly could not protect themselves, not to hand power to an impatient heir. The words flowed from me not as rehearsed rhetoric, but as the distilled essence of everything I had ever believed, and when I sat down again I saw the judge nod slightly, as though recalling his own teachers who had once warned him of the same truths. But the midpoint of this story, the real pivot, came not with my testimony, but with the sudden revelation that Derek's lawyer, in his eagerness, submitted a copy of the first will, the very document I had been coerced to consider during my recovery at a home. The court now had in its hands the text that left everything to Derek, erasing the charitable bequests. My son's attorney presented it triumphantly, saying it proved intent, that I had already moved towards simplifying the estate, that guardianship would only ensure the completion of what I had started. I sat frozen for a moment, watching Derek's expression tighten, with something between triumph and fear, because he knew what I knew. There was another will, one he had never seen, locked in the bank vault, written with deliberate clarity to contradict this charade. Harold leaned close to me and whispered, "Now is the time." He rose and requested that the court issue an order to examine my safety deposit box, arguing that the existence of a later will, properly notarized and witnessed, would nullify the earlier, document and reveal my true intentions. The judge, skeptical but intrigued, granted the request, scheduling the inspection for the following week. Derek's face drained of color at the announcement, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw panic flicker behind his controlled mask. He tried to interrupt, insisting that no such document existed, that his father was being manipulated by so-called friends, but the outburst only revealed his desperation. I remained silent, my hands folded, my gaze steady, because I knew the truth was waiting in that vault, and once it emerged, the balance of power would shift irreversibly. That evening, back at my house, I sat alone in the study, surrounded by Margaret's books, and felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The midpoint of my ordeal had been reached, the line drawn. Either the court would open that box and read the testament of my true will, or my son would succeed in reducing me to a ward of his ambition. For the first time in years, I prayed aloud, not for victory, but for the strength to endure the humiliation of having my deepest intentions exposed in a public forum. The law, which I had trusted all my life, would now become either my shield or my tombstone, and I could only wait for the moment when the second will, written in loneliness and defiance, would finally see the light of day. The week leading up to the opening of the safety deposit box stretched like a taut wire, each day vibrating with unease, and though I had prepared myself for resistance, I had underestimated the lengths to which Derek would go once he realized that his strategy was slipping from his grasp. He stopped visiting me in person and instead began calling with clipped, rehearsed tones, alternating between feigned concern for my health and veiled threats about how embarrassing it would be for me if confusion or contradictory documents were exposed in public. When I refused to answer, he left long voice messages that began with phrases like, "Dad, I'm only trying to protect you," and ended with bitter accusations that I was letting strangers poison me against my own family. I listened once, deleted the rest, and sat in my study with the shades drawn, realizing that the boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a man who had convinced himself that betrayal was filial duty and theft was protection. On the morning of the inspection, Harold and I arrived at the bank accompanied by a clerk from the court. The vault was colder than I remembered, the walls echoing with the metallic sound of locks turning, and when the deposit box was set upon the table and opened with the small key I had carried for years on a chain around my neck, my heart pounded with the strange sensation of handing over not merely a document but a piece of my soul. Inside lay the folder containing my handwritten second will, notarized with the neat stamp and signature of the bank manager, dated weeks after Derek had attempted to coerce me into signing the first. The clerk examined it, checked the signatures, confirmed the dates, and then carefully sealed it again to be presented at the next hearing. As we left, Harold put a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "It will stand. The law will see it for what it is." I wanted to believe him, but I knew Derek well enough to understand that he would not retreat quietly. My prediction proved correct within days. His lawyer filed motions challenging the authenticity of the second will, suggesting that it had been forged under undue influence, and even hinting that my state of mind at the time might have rendered me incapable of understanding what I had written. They submitted affidavits from acquaintances I barely remembered, casual neighbors, and former associates whom Derek had somehow persuaded to testify that I had seemed forgetful or confused in casual conversation. Reading their statements was like watching strangers describe a man who shared my name but not my essence. Tales of misplaced keys, of repeating stories of wandering in thought. None of it was substantive, but in the hands of a clever attorney, even trifles can be woven into a narrative of decline. I felt my anger mounting not just at Derek, but at the system I had once defended, realizing how easily the tools of justice could be twisted into instruments of humiliation. At night, alone in my house, I would pace the rooms and recall Margaret's voice, steady and practical, reminding me that truth is not always loud, but it endures. I knew I had to endure long enough to see Derek's facade collapse. And collapse it began, though not in the way I expected. A week before the next hearing, a young nurse from the hospital where I had recovered from the accident contacted Harold's office. She asked to speak privately and then revealed that during my stay she had overheard Derek in the hallway, speaking urgently on his phone. She remembered his words clearly because they had unsettled her. "Once the court gives me control, it's all mine. The old man doesn't even know what day it is." The nurse had been reluctant to come forward, fearing entanglement, but her conscience had gnawed at her until she could no longer stay silent. Her testimony, Harold assured me, could prove devastating. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was tense. Derek sat stiffly beside his attorney, his eyes darting toward me with the coldness of a gambler who suspects his cards are about to be revealed as counterfeit. The judge allowed the introduction of the nurse's testimony, and when she described in calm, precise detail what she had heard, I saw Derek's composure falter. He shook his head, whispered to his lawyer, but the damage was done. The words painted a picture of intent that no amount of denial could erase, not protection, not concern, but possession, ambition, stripped bare. Harold pressed the point further, producing records of Derek's financial dealings that suggested substantial debts from failed investments. The motive was laid out like a trail of breadcrumbs, leading straight from desperation to betrayal. Yet Derek did not concede. Instead, he erupted in a fury that shocked even me. Rising from his chair, he accused me of betrayal, of rewriting history, of destroying the family legacy. His voice cracked with rage as he shouted that I had never loved him, that I had always favored ideals over blood, that everything I had built belonged to him by right. The judge banged his gavel, ordering silence, but the outburst lingered in the air, raw and undeniable, a confession disguised as an accusation. For the first time, the courtroom saw not a concerned son, but a desperate man clawing for control. After the session, I returned home drained but strangely lighter, as if the mask Derek had worn for so long had finally slipped in full view of the law. Still, the escalation was far from over. Over the following weeks, Derek launched a new offensive, attempting to freeze my accounts by claiming I was making erratic withdrawals. He filed complaints with the state medical board demanding another evaluation of my capacity. He even sent me letters, handwritten in an almost childish scrawl, begging me to reconsider, alternating between threats of isolation and promises of reconciliation. I kept them all in a drawer, not as mementos of his desperation, but as evidence of the corrosion of his soul. The true escalation, however, came when Derek, cornered and furious, turned to lies so vicious they nearly broke me. In one filing, his attorney presented supposed statements from Margaret, dated years before her death, suggesting she had confided to him that she worried about my indifference, my supposed neglect, my coldness as a husband. When I read those words in the sterile type of a legal document, I felt my chest seize as if the air had been poisoned. Margaret, who had shared my life for over 4 decades with patience, humor, and devotion, reduced to a weapon wielded against me. I knew instantly they were false, concocted distortions perhaps based on fragments of her private worries, twisted into accusations. But the cruelty of seeing her name used to tarnish me, to shake my confidence, nearly drove me to despair. I spent long nights staring at her photograph on the mantel, whispering to her memory that I knew the truth of our love, that no court, no lawyer, no bitter son could undo the bond we had lived. And slowly I found strength in the very cruelty of Derek's tactic, because it revealed his desperation. A man secure in his case does not dig through the grave of his mother to attack his father. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, and though the pain of that violation would never fully leave me, it steeled my resolve. By the time the next hearing arrived, I walked into the courtroom not as a victim, but as a man determined to expose the truth. I carried with me not just the will, but the knowledge that Derek's own words, his debts, his fabrications, and his fury had already betrayed him. The escalation had reached its peak, and though the war was not yet won, I could see the path forward, through the lies, through the humiliation, to the moment when justice, slow and weary though it may be, would finally rise. The day the safety deposit box was opened in court and the second will read aloud was not merely a hearing, but the culmination of every sleepless night, every humiliation, every whispered doubt about whether truth could withstand the machinery of greed. And I remember walking into the courtroom with my cane in one hand and Harold at my side, my breath steady, my mind focused, not on victory but on survival. Because at 81, you stop thinking about triumphs and start thinking about leaving the world with your dignity intact. Derek sat across from me at the petitioner's table, his lawyer shuffling papers with nervous hands, and though my son still wore the sharp suit and the polished shoes, his face betrayed the tension of a man who knew the foundation beneath him was crumbling. He would not look at me at first, but when our eyes finally met, I saw no love, no hesitation, only the hard glint of someone determined to wrest control even at the cost of blood. The judge called for the sealed envelope, and when the clerk handed it forward, a hush fell across the room. It was a silence I had known in my years as a professor, the kind that descends when students realize they are about to learn something irreversible. And in that silence, my heart pounded with the memory of Margaret's voice, urging me to be steady, to let the truth speak. The seal was broken, the papers unfolded, and as the judge began to read, the words echoed through the chamber like a verdict delivered by time itself. The reaffirmation of my charitable intentions, the allocation of funds to scholarships, to libraries, to research, and then the deliberate restriction of Derek's share to a modest inheritance, enough for comfort but not for dominance. And finally, the closing lines, the words I had written by hand in the solitude of my study, addressed to any court that might one day examine them, that this decision was not born of malice, but of necessity, that I had seen the hunger in my sons' eyes and knew it would consume everything if unchecked. As those sentences were read aloud, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders, replaced by a grim serenity. Derek's lawyer leapt to his feet, objecting, declaring that the will was forged, that it had been written under undue influence, that I had been manipulated by outsiders. But Harold rose with calm authority, producing the notarization, the bank records, the witness signatures, each fact a nail driven into the coffin of their argument. And then, as if fate had conspired to deliver the final blow, the young nurse stepped forward again, repeating her testimony with quiet strength, reminding the court of Derek's words at the hospital. "Once the court gives me control, it's all mine." Her voice did not waver, and I watched the judge's expression harden as the truth settled like a stone in water, undeniable and heavy. Derek, cornered, erupted once more, his mask torn away. He stood, his voice rising, accusing me of betrayal, of disowning my own blood, of caring more for strangers than for my family. His words poured out not as reasoned argument, but as the bitter cry of a man exposed, and in that unrestrained fury he revealed to the court everything I had long known, that this was not love, not protection, but possession, greed laid bare. The judge struck the gavel, ordering him to sit, but the damage was irreparable. The outburst had shattered any pretense of filial concern. When at last the judge delivered his ruling, affirming the validity of the second will and denying the petition for guardianship, I felt the room blur for a moment, not from weakness, but from the sudden release of pressure that had built inside me. For months, the sound of the gavel echoed like the closing of a chapter, and I turned my eyes toward Derek, not with triumph, but with sorrow, because in that instant I saw the full measure of his downfall, the humiliation of a man stripped of pretense, forced to watch as the prize he had schemed for slipped beyond his reach. He gathered his papers with trembling hands, muttering to his lawyer, his face pale with rage and shame, and when he finally looked at me, his expression was not that of a son, but of an adversary defeated. He left the courtroom without another word, the echo of his footsteps receding like the fading sound of a life that could have been different. For me, the climax was not the ruling itself, but the realization that I had faced my son in the arena of law and memory, and though I had preserved my intentions, I had lost something irretrievable. No father should have to stand in a courtroom and defend his sanity against his own child. No man should be forced to write a will, not as a gift of love, but as a shield against betrayal. And yet that is what life had demanded of me, and that is what I had endured. The papers lay on the judge's desk, the ink of my own hand preserved, and I knew then that Margaret's vision would live on, that our fortune would serve more than greed, that justice, fragile though it may be, had prevailed for one final time in my name. When the final ruling had been entered into record and the courtroom emptied, I stepped into the cool Virginia air with Harold at my side, and for the first time in months I felt as though I could breathe without the weight of someone pressing upon my chest, though the victory carried no sweetness, only the bitter taste of a battle that should never have been fought. Derek did not speak to me again after that day, and though part of me hoped he might at least write, perhaps to offer some explanation or even an apology, no such message ever came. His silence was its own verdict, a declaration that the bond between us had been severed not by my will, but by his choices, and I have had to live with that silence echoing through the rooms of my house like a reminder of the emptiness greed leaves behind. In the months that followed, I set about finalizing the arrangements I had long envisioned with Margaret, ensuring that the scholarships bore her name, that the library wing would be dedicated to her memory, that the research fund would carry forward the principles we had cherished when we were young and idealistic and believed that knowledge could better the world. I spent long afternoons with foundation directors, university administrators, and lawyers drafting the final provisions so that no future challenge could undo what we had defended. Each meeting was both exhausting and consoling. Exhausting because I was reminded of how frail my body had become, consoling because I knew that Margaret's spirit lived on in these decisions, that her kindness would not be erased by the hunger of our son. At home, I discovered a new rhythm to my solitude. The mornings were still quiet, the coffee still brewed with the same slow care, the newspaper still unfolded across the table. But the silence felt different now. It was no longer the oppressive silence of dread, waiting for the next summons or accusation, but the quieter, heavier silence of acceptance. I had faced the storm, I had endured the betrayal, and though the cost was high, I had preserved the essence of what mattered. There are nights when the weight of it all bears down on me, when I replay Derek's furious words, his face twisted with resentment, his voice rising as he accused me of disowning him. I wonder then if I failed him in ways I never understood, if the very security I gave him had been a poison that eroded his sense of gratitude, if I mistook provision for parenting. But I also know that a man cannot rewrite his life in hindsight, that regret cannot alter what is already etched into memory. In quiet moments I sit in my study and gaze at Margaret's photograph, and I speak to her as if she were in the next room. I tell her that I tried, that I fought not just for the fortune but for the meaning behind it, that I could not allow our life's work to be reduced to a figure on a balance sheet. Sometimes I imagine her smiling, nodding, telling me that justice, even late in life, is still justice. And though I am alone, I no longer feel powerless. I am not waiting for reconciliation, not hoping for Derek to return, because I know the man he has become cannot see past his own ambition. What I hold on to instead is the knowledge that when I am gone, the world will remember Margaret and me, not for the courtroom battles or the betrayal, but for the students who study with the scholarships we created, for the books that line the new, library shelves for the discoveries funded by our bequest. That is the legacy we wanted, and it has been secured. There is a certain kind of peace that comes not from triumph, but from survival, from knowing that even when family is turned against you, even when love has been warped into greed, you remained true to yourself. I sit in my armchair by the window, watching the seasons change over the trees Margaret once planted, and though I am an old man with little time left, I feel that I have done my duty. My son may carry my name, but the values, the heart, the integrity of my life are carried forward elsewhere, beyond his reach, beyond his hunger. And when the day comes that I join Margaret, I will go knowing that I did not surrender, that I held fast against the tide, and that in the end dignity was preserved.